Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. My hair looks terrible. Anyway, for those of you who may be new here, this is different from the public live chat. This is the patrons only live chat. So instead of doing one big presentation and doing Q&A at the end, we do Q&A throughout this. So I've got this list of what this looks like about 10, 11, 12 things to get through today. I'm going to discuss them, and as that happens, I'll stop after each item and address any comments at all. We've rarely had more than 5 to 10 people on this live, so that means I get to interact with every single comment. So anything you want to say, we're discussing it. It's more of a conversation than the big, massive public live chats. It seems like it's a beautiful day here in much of the United States. It's pretty sunny. Maybe we're going to be losing folks. We've only got 2 watching live so far, but it could grow from there. With all of these chats, at least 50 patrons end up watching it after the fact. So here we go. I have got. I always think it's a good program worth of stuff, but I think it's an interesting mix today that actually kind of ties together thematically. We're always sort of experimenting with how these things work, but there's a fair amount going on, and we should talk about it. Probably the biggest news this month in foreign policy, or at least from the United States perspective, was the announcement that the United States is going to get out of Afghanistan by September 11th. I think that's probably a little cheesy. That's an interesting choice of date, of course. It's important to acknowledge that this blows through the deadline that Trump set for May 1st. I think there's a distinct possibility, starting today, was when Trump committed the U.S. to be completely out of Afghanistan. Biden has pushed the timeline further. I think that it's certainly possible that the Taliban will react to this with attacks on U.S. soldiers, which they have not carried out since the deal with Trump at some point last year. But it doesn't seem like it doesn't seem to me like something that would make a lot of sense. I think that most of the U.S. public wants to leave Afghanistan. It seems like Joe Biden himself wants to leave Afghanistan. So I don't know if it would be particularly rational for Taliban to start killing U.S. soldiers again and possibly trigger the sorts of aggressive resentment that the U.S. public is known so well for. I mean, keep in mind, after 5 years, well, not 5, but yeah, after 4 years of fairly principled anti-interventionist stance in Syria, stopping the U.S. military-industrial complex from getting into Syria, all it took was 2 dead American journalists and a charismatic videotape to get the United States into Syria. And we're still there today. So I think the Taliban hopefully isn't stupid enough to start attacking U.S. soldiers in great numbers. But hey, who knows? It's a medieval a group of crazy fundamentalists who have actually just beaten the most powerful country in the world. So who knows how they're going to react? Regardless, I do think that yes, we're going to see this withdrawal around by September 11th, and I think that is a very good thing. I think that it's important to qualify what the U.S. withdrawal is going to look like. But so I go back and forth with this. Actually, I'm sort of arguing with myself as more pieces of information come across the transom, and as I think about it more and more deeply. I think the cynical approach, which is accurate and true, and at one level is absolutely true, is the United States is going to do everything it can to continue its war in Afghanistan, but from a remove. We're going to still see contractors there. We're still going to see special forces jumping in and doing operations. And now that things are almost completely mobile, it's not clear to me exactly from which country we're supposed to be launching our drone flights. But honestly, the way that this technology is trending, and of course the way cruise missiles work and what have you, like we retain the power to bomb Afghanistan from a wide range of places. So I think we do need to be vigilant about, like, okay, just because we've got our troops out of Afghanistan, it does not mean that the U.S.'s forever war in Afghanistan has ended. There are something like 18,000 contractors. There's an interesting, in the country, there's an interesting qualification of that 18,000 contractors number that I haven't seen disputed elsewhere, is that, yes, there are 18,000 U.S. funded contractors in Afghanistan that do dwarf the number of combat troops from the United States. But my understanding is, and I haven't seen this contradicted, maybe it's wrong, maybe it's bullshit propaganda, is that actually only about 1,000 of those contractors are armed. The designation of a military contractor can include janitorial staff, admin folks, folks who are managing the place, and folks who run the motor pool, a wide range of folks that aren't necessarily, the contractor, retired special forces that we imagine the contractor to be. So I don't know. I think that's a little up in the air, but so while, yes, suspicion about the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan is warranted, it's also important to emphasize that this is a big step. What's interesting, and an aspect that I kind of want to read up more on, is that the current force pursuing U.S. war aims in Afghanistan is majority from other countries. NATO allies apparently make up 75% of the 10,000 official military forces that are in Afghanistan. Of course, we don't know what that means. Maybe they're doing all kinds of rear echelon bullshit mostly. But I mean, that is significant. I mean, if we're going to have 10,000 foreign troops gone by September 11th, like, that is a more real contribution to the Afghan state of play that is going away. And I do not expect NATO forces to outlast the United States in Afghanistan. It's a fanciful notion that I don't expect to occur. So yeah, I think the cynicism about our withdrawal from Afghanistan is absolutely, completely warranted, and we need to remain vigilant about, like, what actually happens in Afghanistan after the more telegenic, more politically salient official U.S. troops leave, whose deaths bring Afghanistan back to our attention. We need to pay attention to the drone war. We need to pay attention to special forces. We need to pay attention to military contractors. However, this withdrawal of official NATO forces from Afghanistan is a big deal. It is a step forward, and we should acknowledge that. And I think, there's some reporting around the idea that this actually is something that Joe Biden really wants to do due to his long experience of failing in Afghanistan. There's a fantastic excerpt from, I think it's the book on Richard Holbrooke, the guy who famously did the Dayton Accords and famously killed himself trying to resolve the conflict in Afghanistan, sort of talking to Joe Biden, and Joe Biden just being like, essentially being, and really, like, profanity laden, being just like, fuck that noise. Like, we need to get the hell out of Afghanistan. We're not there to, like, make the world safe for feminist values. We need to leave. It's absurd that we have our fellows over there dying to do this imperial bullshit. That's not, he wasn't quite that emphatic, but that was definitely the subtext. And much has been made, I think, fairly, of the fact that of our recent presidents, I think since Carter, I mean, he's basically the first U.S. president in certainly this century, and maybe even for half a century before, to have an actual child in U.S. uniform, which is pretty shocking when you think about it. So yeah, he's pretty committed to getting U.S. soldiers out of there. I doubt he's very committed at all to Afghan peace and real U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. But we take the victories we can take. Logo Cool. Okay, before we move on, Logo Cool Extreme says, fun fact: the Taliban actually offered to surrender in 2002 in return for political recognition as a political party, and that absolutely would have been the better choice. And the U.S. turned them down. Yeah, it's really, the more I read about, I think I've talked a lot recently about Iran and U.S. relations in the aftermath of 9/11, and how, basically Iran was ready to give the United States absolutely everything it wanted, even more one-sided and invasive than the JCPOA, which Iran did actually sign. And the U.S. just sort of threw it in their face because we don't care. We're all powerful. Look what we just did to Afghanistan and Iraq. We don't need to make deals. Ha 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 ha. And that's not how that worked out. But yeah, it is. I think I do recall reading something about that recently, about how the Taliban was ready to back off. I'm sure there were a few more conditions than just that logo, but still, yeah. I mean, it was a fantastic deal the Taliban was very willing to make, and would have led to a much happier, more peaceful Afghanistan. But no, the U.S. was too tough. I mean, it's a really interesting, just philosophical and practical question. It's just like, when you have overwhelming force, but you're unwilling to accept the victories that can give you because you're so fucking full of yourself and your overwhelming force, it can do a lot of long-term damage, both to certainly to the populations of the countries that have been invaded, but also to the broader program of American empire, hegemony, or liberal international order, or what have you. Because really, it's a set of overwhelming force that is interested in continuing to be used. If we had actually taken the advantages that the victories in Iraq and Afghanistan had given us, then there would have been no reason for continued money spinning by U.S. military forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's a sort of a sad fact. Yes, absolutely. The actions of insurgents and freedom fighters, and yes, Iranian investment and Saudi investment and whatnot had a big contribution to the failure of the U.S. projects in Iraq and Afghanistan. But mostly it was U.S. hubris. If the U.S. had taken the deals that Afghanistan, Iran were willing to make in the 2003-2004 period, we'd look back at Bush as a genius. And actually, I mean, maybe for humanity, it was a good thing that we didn't take those deals, because we'd have a much more explicit and successful, perhaps we'd have had a much more explicit and successful U.S. empire at this point if we had. It's sort of an interesting thing to think about. Sort of a lot like, and similar in some ways to, World War I. I think from the European perspective, which is something that I'm still, I'm still very rooted in, as much as I try to struggle against it. It's very easy, and you see this in a lot of the memorialization of World War I, which we'd had over the past 5 years, as sort of the 100th anniversary of the start of World War I in 1914, in 2014, through the anniversary of the end of World War I in 2018. We saw a lot of memorialization of World War I and a sort of dismantling of the old glorious narratives around World War I, such as they were. It was not even at the time, nobody thought World War I was a glorious, great idea. But obviously any sense of that was thrown out by the memorialization in 2014 through 2018. And I very much agree with the consensus that, look at this horrible, horrible thing that we did to ourselves, the European culture committing suicide, how insane, how terrible, how horrible. And yes, it's insane, terrible, horrible. It was this extraordinary own goal and horrific disaster for the Europeans, and also certainly for colonialized peoples as well, who died in droves in these world war conflicts. But if it weren't for these horrific world wars, that European civilization had done to itself, then decolonization and the end of worldwide empire would have been something that would have taken much, much longer. So it's an interesting contrast, and certainly if the U.S. had been as successful in the post 9/11 wars as these deals made possible, certainly many lives would have been saved in the many lives, literally a million lives would have been saved at this point. But we would also have had a much more explicit U.S.-led empire, and I don't think that would have been a good thing for humanity. Okay, sorry to go off on that tangent, as often happens here. So the Kyrgyz versus the Tajiks. This is an interesting one that hopefully will. It's interesting doing these patrons-only newscasts. I try to grab everything that's important from the month before, but I also tend to be very driven because I'm doing this research, the morning before this and the day or two before when I'm collecting topics. And the reason we're talking about Kyrgyzstan versus Tajikistan is because a conflict between these two post-Soviet republics in Central Asia, two of the stands, broke out this week. So my fond hope is that we will not have to talk about Kyrgyzstan versus Tajikistan ever again on this channel. Well, I don't know about ever again. I'd like to get to the stands at some point, but hopefully this is the last we'll have to discuss the two of them, because it's just a border conflict that tamped down. It's not clear that that's the case. That's what we hope is the case. It's pretty grim what happened this week. It was a border. I mean, it was a border conflict or just a border conflict. But when you think that the body counts we're seeing from Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are quite similar in number to some of the body counts we get from border conflicts between India and China, that's really horrifying because Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are tiny, tiny countries. Kyrgyzstan is around 6 million people. Tajikistan is around 9 million people. So we're talking, that's 10. Yeah, that's two or three orders of magnitude larger countries having border conflicts with similar body counts. That's pretty horrifying. So when you consider the populations of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, the fact that something between 30 to 60 people died in border conflicts this week, that's a big effing deal. There's a lot of scary footage coming out, burning villages, what have you. So I think it is possible that this is just a border conflict that we hopefully will not have to talk about again. But it's also a big effing border conflict. This is a big deal. And it's tragic. I mean, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, I did a little bit of research. I'm pretty sure these are the poorest of the stans, rather a poor collection of countries in Central Asia. There just hasn't been a lot going on in this part of the world for a number of centuries. Famously, the Great Game was played out, a bit in these areas to the extent that there was really anybody there. As I've talked about a lot and written in the book, sort of around the idea that actually the Great Game between Britain and Russia in the 19th century was kind of bullshit. Because while Britain's winnings in the Great Game were things like in all of India and Pakistan, some of the most lucrative and most populous areas in the entire world, whereas Russians' winnings were places like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, which even 150 years later, Kyrgyzstan still has 6 million people. Tajikistan has 9 million people. I mean, these are tiny, tiny places. Like all of the stands, I think with the exception of Kazakhstan, actually, I think if you added up the population of all the stands, it would be somewhere around the population of California or maybe even Texas. These are tiny, tiny countries without a lot of people. They have become more significant recently because of oil and gas resources. I think Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan are some of the poorest of the stands because they don't have as much in the way of oil and gas resources. So it's really sad to see these tremendously poor countries getting into battle. It seems as though it got bad enough that regular forces were drawn in, but what little I've read on this makes me believe that it could have been a bottom-up sort of thing. It's the sort of thing that I'm sure excites folks who are interested in water war. I ran a video on Thursday talking about how the whole concept of water wars kind of pisses me off. Absolutely, climate change is a thing. Absolutely, water scarcity is a real problem that needs to be looked into. But the idea that the Pentagon is somehow going to help us solve climate change or help us solve water wars, or that we should primarily be thinking about climate change and water scarcity and it's going to make things less secure, instead of like, ooh, how do we ameliorate this, or what technologies do we need to stop this from happening? It appears that the initial clash that launched this problem between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan was in fact a dispute over a source of water. So my understanding is that they were conflict was sparked around Voruk, which is a exclave of Tajikistan within Kyrgyzstan. I think Axological Extreme, I will answer this question now, asked, does this have anything to do with Soviet planning? And yes, it does, because Tajikistan had, and I do not have the necessary background on the ethnic differences between Tajiks and Kyrgyz, and I think we can say with great confidence that it exists now, because that certainly seems to be a thread in this conflict between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. I don't know the extent to which these ethnic identities are ethnic, or I don't think they're religious. I think everyone's Muslim, but who knows? There could be different sects, or whether they're national. Don't know, but it is a fact that there are Tajik exclaves within Kyrgyzstan. This means that the territory of Kyrgyzstan surrounds entirely these sections of Tajik territory. And I think it's likely that there is some ethnic or national dimension that makes Kyrgyz and Tajik people different, and that those exclaves different from the surrounding Kyrgyz territories. So yes, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan fighting over these exclaves. The fighting was sparked in the Voruk exclave, but my understanding is that it spread pretty far. Tens of miles, causing the military capture of border posts, easily 10,000 refugees. Again, consider what 10,000 refugees means in a country the size of Kyrgyzstan, of 6 million people. All kinds of scary shit. What it seems as though the prime ministers are talking, it seems as though on the top level of the elites that govern Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, there's a fair amount of, what the hell is going on here? Yes, we need to resolve whatever this issue is, so things don't get worse. Whereas it seems like on the ground there may be some danger of things sparking forward. So it's not entirely clear what's going on at this point. I'm definitely going to be following it more, but hopefully this is the last we'll have to talk about it, because it has because it did end up just being a flare-up border issue. However, with Nagorno-Karabakh, I think there was instantly some folks on Twitter who pointed out that there was some jokes about how, it looks like Turkey and Russia are going to have to start doing joint patrols, the way that the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan ended. And that's obviously, these are extraordinarily different situations in which neither Turkey nor Russia, frankly, I think cares that much. These are vastly poor countries, sort of in the middle of nowhere. But it's important to remember that before the Nagorno-Karabakh War, I guess the second Nagorno-Karabakh War, is that what we're calling it about? That broke out and resolved so unhappily for Armenia and happily for Azerbaijan at the cost of, I think we said what, 10,000, thousands of lives, regardless. Um, there were premonitions, there were minor things that sort of like, oh gosh, that something bad's happening in Nagorno-Karabakh. Oh, we don't have to pay attention anymore. It's gone now. But this is, this is a warning like that. And I think a sign that we should probably pay a little more attention to what's going on in the Stans. If not just because of, human concern and general positivity, but also this is a really likely place for conflict to break out between Russia and China and Iran. In the United States, I'm sure there's a lot of fantasists in Washington, D.C. who like to envision these countries as, an axis of anti-U.S. axisness. But really, there are a lot of natural conflict cleavages for Russia, China, and Iran in this area, and probably not in the 2020s. You could see conflict breaking out, or proxy conflicts breaking out between those countries, but maybe by the 2030s. So it's something to keep in mind, that these fissures are there and exist. Okay, I think I answered Loga's question, saying, does this have anything to do with Soviet planning? Yes, it does. The Soviets were all about managing ethnicities. They, very similar to the Chinese government up until recently, or actually maybe very similar to the Chinese government today. They had a lot of lip service paid to national self-determination, and they were all about, how important each republic's nationality and its national character was, while at the same time doing all manner of things, from population transfers to gussying up actual conflicts between ethnicities. That was certainly an aspect of the conflict between Armenians and Azeris within the Soviet Union. So yeah, I think it's very likely that these exclaves were fostered and set up and preserved by Soviet planners who wanted to make sure that these republics were going to naturally be more antagonistic to each other than they were to Moscow. So yeah, I mean, I did make clear that all of these countries used to be part of the Soviet Union until 89, 90, 91. I can't recall exactly when the Union broke up. Was it 92? But yeah. So yes, definitely had a lot to do with Soviet planning. Salman Siddiqui says, no expert, but Tajik is a Persian language and Kyrgyz is a Turkic one. Oh, interesting. Well, that's fascinating. Tajik is a Persian language and Kyrgyz is a Turkic one. Fascinating. I am not, as the fact that I'm learning that for the first time indicates, I am not an expert on Tajik versus Kyrgyz nationalities or issues either, though I think that very well illustrates my point that this is a possible place, sort of front line between differing nations, and gives a opportunity for proxy warfare. Of course, I didn't even mention Turkey, which also professes to have a deep interest in the Stans because of their shared Turkic history. Local Extreme says, so is this the actions of petty warlords in the Kyrgyzstan and Tajik army? I can't really speak to that, but I think it's also quite possible that it's petty anger between national groups, of course, taken advantage of by whatever local, local schmuck or military folk is. I mean, Logan, I don't know if you read more about this than I have. I couldn't speak to it. Salman Siddiqui answers the same question, saying no idea, but I thought that originally the Soviet borders weren't ever supposed to be national borders. Not sure I quite understand. Like it's the union of Soviet socialist republics. The Russian Empire, of course, did not much like the idea of nationalism or national borders, but because the Communist Party of Russia came from a very sort of World War I, pre-Hitler, anti-nationalist milieu or ideological perspective, nationalism was always, as it was everywhere among sort of forward-thinking progressive people before World War II, as a positive force that was worthwhile, that was worth preserving. So these parts of the empire were consciously set up as republics that respected the national self-will of these peoples. And I think some would even argue that aspects of the national culture of these places were to some extent consciously created by Soviet planners and ideology. But obviously, the Soviets did not want those republics to become independent, and very consciously would, I'm sure anybody who would have suggested that in these republics would have quickly found themselves shot, not just under Stalin, but under anybody. So yeah, obviously the Soviets didn't want them to be independent, but they definitely played with those borders of them. I mean, the borders of, my understanding is that the borders of these countries today are the borders that were set up by the Soviet Union when they were trying to manage these different republics. I could be wrong about that. I'm sure I'm wrong about that in certain instances, because things have changed since or during the conflicts of the thing breaking up. But yeah, I'm not sure I quite understand the question. We have 5 people watching now. This is very exciting. And if anybody has any more questions, Chad is a fascinating thing happening in a country that I want to know more about, and I am learning more about as sort of side order of my Sudan studies, never-ending Sudan studies. So Chad is under Libya, directly south of Libya, directly to the west of Sudan. And it is sort of in the center of the Sahel, which we keep hearing about. This is where the terrorists are now. This is where Islamic State is really going on. I feel like The Economist every 6 months runs a story to get everybody excited about fighting the Islamic State in the Sahel, and how this is where the real action is. And the thing about action in the Sahel, something that I've, among many other things, have always wanted to research more, is that the reason there's so much action in the Sahel is because the United States and France destroyed Libya. The destruction of Libya in 2011 created a cascade of fighters and Libyan arms that just spun out of Libya's various civil wars and decomposition to destroy countries throughout the Sahel, the belt of countries below the Sahara. Well, actually, many of them include a lot of the Sahara in that belt across Africa. Mali, most famously, was a really well-run. Well, it was famously a stable country that was able to make progress towards development before the destruction of Libya. The cascade that came from that resulted in a jihadist insurgency that destabilized Libya. I think that insurgency that briefly took over, destabilized Mali. That insurgency that briefly overtook Mali entirely was defeated, but Mali is still not a stable place today. I think had a coup last year that I have not read anywhere near enough about. Burkina Faso is a mess. Northern Nigeria is quite obviously a mess, was a mess before the destruction of Libya, but the destruction of Libya certainly didn't help. Chad was, for better and for worse, one of the more stable of those countries, because Chad had a military strongman until April 19th. Well, still has a military strongman today, but has a new one. Until April 19th. Chad, the president of Chad, that's Idris Deby, I apologize, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, was a linchpin of French and to a lesser degree American policy in the Sahel. He's The extent to which jihadists actually exist in the Sahel is a really interesting question that I need to examine more, because I don't quite understand it. Absolutely, there's no question there are jihadist-affiliated rebel forces in the Sahel. I don't think these are folks, plotting the next 9/11 or, how to get machine guns to disgruntled Muslims in San Bernardino or anything. These folks are affiliated with the Islamic State or Al Qaeda or whatnot because it seems cool and because it seems like a way to get weapons for the fight that they want to fight, which is against nasty, immortal strongmen dictator types like Idris Deby in Chad. So I think one of the really problematic aspects of the French and American presence in the Sahel is like, to what extent are we fighting jihadists? And to what extent are we just arming and training and increasing the problem of anti-democratic strongmen? I think Idris Deby had just won his sixth presidential election. I think African strongmen are a little more sophisticated now. I'd be surprised if he won this by 99% or something like that. But nobody thinks that the election was free or fair. Idris Deby had been the president/dictator of Chad for 30 years, and the fact that I think he was a great beneficiary of the destruction of Libya because he was able to be the strong, stable type that would help France and the United States crush all of the jihadist militias that they had created by destroying Libya. So it's this sort of the classic self-licking ice cream cone is a good metaphor that I hear for sort of military industrial complex type stuff, and that is absolutely something that has been set up in the Sahel. Strangely, right after the founding of the United States Africa Command in 2008. By 2011, we destroyed Libya and given the Africa Command infinite work to do throughout the Sahel. That may sound crazy cynical, but it's also what happened. I think, so what happened, what happened on April 19th was Idris Deby, who had profited so much from the chaos of the destruction of Libya, was destroyed by the destruction of Libya. I think what's happening in Libya now is that after the failure of Khalifa Haftar's offensive on Libya, something we've talked about a ton on this channel, I won't go into right now. A lot of the militias that he supported have been freed up, and some of them have gone back to Chad. And because Idris Deby was so involved with French and U.S. sponsorship, many of his very reliable, or more reliable than most other militaries in the region, soldiers were off in other places in the Sahel. I don't know exactly where. I think Mali probably. There's a great podcast in the link that on this topic that I intend to finish listening to. Anyway, his soldiers that he needed were not around. So it appears that his regime was surprised by the advent of a new group of militias coming down from Libya because they no longer had as much to do after Khalifa Haftar's defeated offensive on Tripoli. And he was, according to the story, actually killed in battle. This is a head of state dying in battle. This is not something that we see anywhere in the world. I'm not sure if there's another example of this in the 21st century, honestly. This isn't like, Hitler killing himself in his bunker because he's losing, or, Saddam Hussein eventually being executed after trial. The actual story here is that Idris Deby was killed by in open battle with a militia group. Whether or not that's what actually happened is hard to say. In the aftermath of this, I believe Deby's son has attempted to set up a rather straightforward and know enough about and should research more. Wow, it says a lot about what has happened in Libya, what has happened in the Sahel, and what U.S. Am I back? Seem to be having trouble with the connection here. Seem to be having some trouble with the connection here. Can somebody let me know if we're doing okay? But yeah, let me know if we're doing okay with the connection. I'm going to continue talking and answering questions. Okay, yeah, it's okay, good. I hope everything I said about Chad came through, because I'm thinking I can definitely take that out and chunk it and make a video. All right, India. India right now, what's happening in India right now is, well, sorry, we have all these questions. Let's go through the questions. Solomon Sadiq, no idea, but I thought that originally Soviet borders were, okay. Fathel says, the civil war in Libya has devastated Chad. A lot of Chadians used to go to Libya for relatively high paying jobs. That's another really great point. Yeah, it's amazing that everyone's like, oh, what's happening in the Sahel? What's happening in the Sahel? Why isn't Tunisian democracy doing well? And it's because we destroyed Libya and have done essentially nothing for the past decade to bring it back, which is tremendously frustrating. All right. Yeah, and as Local Stream says, but Gaddafi was bad, which is something that gets less and less persuasive as we see this just sort of ramifying disaster continue. Local Stream says, but on a more serious note, do you guys feel like the people who want to overthrow Assad and defending the overthrow of Gaddafi have a bit of a colonial mindset? Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no question. This is straight up imperialism, this idea that we can tell everybody what to do. And of course, something else that I haven't read enough about but want to do more on is it is a straightforward imperial thing that we're up to that France is up to in the Sahel. French West Africa became independent nominally 50 years ago, but the degree of involvement that they have retained in all of those countries, to differing degrees north and south of the Sahara, but yeah, in all of those countries is extreme. I mean, France still controls the currency for a lot of these countries. Still, I mean, the fact that when I'm talking about Chad, like it's important that what the French, whether or not the French will allow Idris Déby's son to set up the next dictatorship in Chad is still way more important than it should be. So yeah, it's pretty grim. Local Extreme says, yeah, it's okay. Murphy says, I hear you fine. That's great. Always irritates me when the internet doesn't work. Merton Muftu says, I don't know about Assad, but the hostilities are starting with Italy and France against Libya made me feel that way. Yeah, that's a very good point. France and Italy are sort of the traditional imperial powers in North Africa, and for them to be all gung-ho for the destruction of Gaddafi, who was really just one leader. I think there was a King Idris or something, not affiliated with Idris Déby. There was King Idris, who was, I think, the first post-independence leader. Then there was Gaddafi. And then NATO destroyed the country. So yeah, it ain't pretty. Fado says hundreds of thousands of Libyans depend on Libyan markets for their income. Oh yeah, sorry, hundreds of thousands of non-Libyans depended on Libyan markets for their income. This is also why Tunisia's democratic experiment, this extraordinary thing, the only Arab country to successfully maintain itself as a democracy for 10 years, is why it's perpetually in danger and why its people are so angry at it, because of economic failure that is once again because the United States and its NATO allies destroyed Libya. It's incredibly frustrating stuff. So, yeah. So, India. India. It's real grim what's happening in India right now. I was looking at this. I was sort of researching it this morning, and last week, about a week ago, India became the first country to have more cases in a single day than the United States did, which is a horrific milestone for any country, especially one that is as poor as India and as lacking in the resources necessary to deal with that level, that U.S. level of irresponsibility. That was a week ago, and I think that was because India had blown through 300,000 cases in a day. Well, it's a week later, and India has now blown through 400,000 cases in a day. This brings us back to the very initial days of the pandemic throughout the world, when we had very little sense of how to control, treat, or ameliorate this disease. So 400,000 infections today means 2 weeks from now, whatever the corresponding level of deaths is. And we've already, for a week or so now, been getting reports of the failure of the Indian medical system. They are running out of oxygen. They're running out of all manner of things, which of course means that our numbers for cases and deaths in India are probably drastically understated. So we've got a situation that is going to be possibly exponentially worse 2 weeks from now. This is already horrific. This is already shaking the Indian government. I don't know. Hopefully, some steps have been taken over 2 weeks ago that we'll begin to see the positive impact of. But it's also entirely possible that this trajectory continues and accelerates. My understanding is that only about 5% of Indians have been vaccinated. So of course that's probably the wealthiest 5% of Indians. So yeah, what we've got now is pretty horrific, pretty fucking horrific. There's not. I often find it. I don't think I'm ever dismissive of death and horror and violence, but I think I often can be glib about it or quickly jump to, well, what are the strategic consequences? I think, was it Noman Saeed? No, I can't pronounce. I probably somebody called me out on Twitter for that last week, and I think that was well taken. I shouldn't be thinking about. Well, of course, I should be thinking about the strategic consequences. I think that's what people come here for, but that should not be the first thing I'm thinking about. I should think about human consequences, and what we're seeing develop in India, and to a lesser extent somehow in Brazil, is it's horrific. It's a horror story. It is a poor country with a collapsing. It is what we'd feared. This is what we feared a year ago, and was averted actually in India and across Africa and in Latin America because of quick action by governing the governments in those regions. This is what we feared at the beginning of March, was developing countries being derailed and experiencing true COVID horror. Seems to be happening in India. And that is fucked. Fucked. And it's sorry. It's bad. And I think it's going to get worse. And I think, I fear it's not going to be something that that just sort of fades away, because we see where we've become accustomed to seeing these nasty, scary peaks. We've seen them in the U.S. a number of times, but I don't think we're at. It feels like a nasty, scary peak in India right now, and I don't think we're at the peak. I think we may just be at the beginning of the slope up to horror, and that's not great. Yeah, to be an asshole, I mean, strategically, the fact that India seems to have been really knocked on its ass by COVID in a way that China has not been, is got some pretty serious strategic consequences. We're all very pleased with ourselves, or at least the Biden administration seems very pleased with its Quad formulation. Oh, we've got Australia, Japan, India, the United States talking together about how to counter China. And if we've got India looking like it's going to have the most horrific COVID fuck up of anybody, superseding the United States, who had the previous most horrific COVID fuck up, but without any of the money and resources to combat it that the United States had, is it's not good. It's certainly not good for the Quad. It's certainly not good for U.S. aspirations to use India to counter China. So, not good, folks. Not good. Look, Local Extreme says, speaking on Libya, I wonder who deserves more blame on it. France led the war, but according to you, Rob, the U.S. did the dirty work and might have planned it ahead. No, I think it is legitimate to say that yes, France and Britain lobbied for this war and wanted this war more than the United States, more than much, certainly more than President Obama personally wanted it. I think Hillary Clinton relished the opportunity to look tough and lobbied for it hard within the United States. But I think you could say that if France and Britain had not pushed the Libya intervention as hard as they did, there's a better chance that it wouldn't have happened. My talking about like the actual fighting, yes, the U.S. did the majority of the actual fighting. Actually, I think there was, famously there were French and British planes that led the assault on Libya, but the night before, all the American warplanes came in and cleared out the anti-aircraft stuff. So yeah, I think the physical fighting was very much U.S. led. But the actual beginning of Libya, I mean, there's plenty of blame to go around. The United States should not have allowed itself to be drawn into this. It's another indication of what a horrifically bad foreign policy leader Hillary Clinton was. But I do think it's fair to say that France and Britain were more important in making the thing happen than the United States was. And we're talking about India. Local Extreme says it's even worse, Rob. Most of the cases have been in the wealthiest state. I shudder to think of what's going on in the largest state of Uttar Pradesh. It has as many people as Brazil. Local Extreme says, I'd say the U.S., since the aftermath was handled horribly. Speaking about Libya, yeah, I think blaming the U.S. for the aftermath. Yeah, I mean, we were unquestionably the biggest, most powerful driving force in the intervention. I think that, but for the limited question of like, why did it happen? I think France and Britain may bear a little more blame. But yeah, the buck stops here. The United States is the biggest, strongest, most powerful country in the world, and we really fucked up Libya. Going back to India, Local Singh says Uttar Pradesh is much poorer and is pure BJP territory. And it's where Adityanath is the chief minister. I think it gets a little inside baseball on Indian politics. But yeah, the interaction between the cataclysmic failure of the ruling BJP party and the BJP's already poisonous anti-Muslim nationalist politics is going to be something that's very scary to watch. I don't know anything about who Adityanath is, but Loga assures me that Adityanath is Modi's sort of number two guy and is even scarier than Modi is in terms of sectarian exterminatory nationalism. So yikes. Okay. Mert Muftio says, Local Cool Extreme, if I recall correctly, RE Libya. The trend in the Turkish press at the time was France and Italy catalyzed the U.S. participation. Belief was U.S. was after the fact. Mert Muftio says, I do not think Quad will be able to put the pedal to the metal against Chinese incrementalism. China will not create a flashpoint that changes minds in four countries. I hope not. But I have been underwhelmed, as I've made pretty clear on the channel, I've been underwhelmed by sort of China's general approach to things over the past 4 years, especially. The Trump presidency provided China an extraordinary opportunity to lead. And by doing that, they could have done extraordinarily well by doing good. They could have truly outmaneuvered the United States in international soft power. Instead, they decided to get into a who's a bigger asshole match with Donald Trump, which, it's impossible to be a bigger asshole than Donald Trump, but it's not going to make anybody like you. So anyway. Okay, so that is, well, and here we are on to China. So China demography is a pretty freaking important thing. I am not one of those who assumes it's the only important thing about China, or even the most important. Actually, no, I may be one of those who think it's the most important thing about China. It's not the only thing that's important about China. Japan has showed that it is possible to still have a very big footprint geopolitically and economically as your population declines. Um, but Japan is also a very, very rich country. China has a larger economy, but it's got, well, under 1.4 billion people now, probably, whereas China's only got, it's under 200. I can't recall what it is, and it's shrinking. So Japan, being a relatively more wealthy country on a per capita basis, has a lot more tools to play with, whereas for China, the root of its power um, to this point has been its massive and massively growing population. If, as seems likely, the results of China's decennial census, which were supposed to be publicized at the beginning of April, have shown that China actually shrank in population in 2020, that's a big fucking deal. It's a very big deal. And it is, and there's controversy around this. The Financial Times reported that population had shrunk in 2020. Chinese government sources had pushed back, saying no, that's not true. But also apparently at the same time, acknowledging that Chinese population will be falling after 2020. It's a big deal, and it is earlier than expected. It indicates that China's efforts to encourage a little more natalism, a little more giving of birth and fertility by ending the one-child policy and by beginning to introduce some benefits for those who have children, have not been working. It's not 100% sure that the most recent census showed a decline in population. It would not have shown a decline in population from 2010 to 2020, but it would be significant enough if it showed a decline in population from 2019 to 2020, which seems to be what we're looking at. And that's not even really COVID effects yet, because kids who would have been born in 2020, would have been for half of 2020 would have been conceived before COVID was a word that anybody knew. So yeah, I mean, this is a huge deal. This is a huge shift, and it will make it tremendously more difficult for China to continue to put up those economic growth numbers that are so vital to the Chinese Communist Party's legitimacy. So yeah, I think this is definitely something worth paying attention to, worth focusing on. Less scared. It's interesting because this, on the one hand, this development undermines the case of war hawks in the United States and Japan and India and elsewhere. But on the other hand, it actually, it's weird, in the long term, this makes China a lot less scary. In the short term, it might even make China a little more scary. So I'm not someone, well, I am very much the kind of person who will be like, what's so fucking scary about China now? Like, look, their population's shrinking. I'm very much that kind of person. As you guys know, if you see my channel, however, I'm cautious about this because in the short term, I think this does make something like the invasion of Taiwan a little more likely. Because if China gets to the point where they're like, wait a second, our economy's peaking, our population is peaking, and the US seems to be getting, after talking about it for a decade, seems like it might really be disengaging from the Middle East right now and bringing those resources back over to Asia. Holy crap, maybe this is our last chance to go for Taiwan. So I think there's a strain in hawkish thinking that I dislike, but I don't think is entirely wrong, where, they're like, well, okay, fine. Like maybe China isn't, the natural next hegemon that we must desperately fight against. But when they realize it, they might become more violent. And I think that's, as much as I dislike that argument, I think it is an argument that has real weight. So yeah, the fact that China's population now seems to be sinking is that's an interesting, very interesting thing, and it's also bad for the world economy because a constantly growing Chinese economy, even though it's great for folks in the U.S. who want war, it's also great for the world economy. And for that Chinese growth engine to look like it's slowing down is sad and scary. And we need another one. And of course, everybody from oil industry executives to corporate planners in every industry has been expecting, okay, China's had its big growth thing. It's kind of ended. And not that, growing at 6% a year is or under 6% now, 2% last year, is presumed to go back to, 5-6% a year going forward. Well, it should be an even bigger year this year, but that's still much smaller than the 10% a year growth that China was putting up in the last decade. So everyone's been expecting India to come and save every industry and save those incredible growth things and start its rampage towards rapid growth. And instead in India, what we're seeing is COVID horror and dysfunction and crazy nationalist government. Yeah, so kind of grim news out of Asia, which is very much. I mean, it's interesting because part of this is like, well, so much for the future of humanity and the future of the economy. No, Asia is the future of humanity and the future of the world economy, unquestionably. But it was never going to be as a smooth a rise as certainly Indian and Chinese government figures hoped and expected, and as many somewhat delusional U.S. businessmen or Western businessmen more broadly had hoped and expected. And I see stuff like this, India and China, the planet's two colossi, population-wise, and soon to be economically as well. And I see them both in such straits. It does not make me feel good about humanity. But that's where we are. Let's talk about Biden's Yemen lie. I think that's where we're the territory we're in right now. In February of 2021, I thrilled to the announcement that the Biden administration was taking steps on Yemen and had committed to the end of support for Saudi offensive operations in Yemen. As I and everyone else noted at the time, there's a lot of weasel words in there. But I was actually a little more sympathetic to that than most of the leftist and rightist critiques of Biden's Yemen policy. It's like I do actually believe that for there to be the end of the war in Yemen, the U.S. commitment to Saudi Arabia's security, actual Saudi security, Saudi Arabian territory, that actually does need to be reemphasized. That does need to be something that the U.S. commits to more strongly. Certainly not by signing a treaty or anything, but makes very clear that we are super serious about Saudi Arabia being secure. Because if we don't, then Saudi Arabia actually has a justification for more brutality and more involvement in the Yemen war. Their whole justification for what they're doing is insecurity for Saudi Arabia. The United States needs to establish that there is security for Saudi Arabia. However, all those leftist and rightist critics who went further against Biden's statements and seemed to, or were like, oh, this is just bullshit, unfortunately, as of 3 months later, seem to have been completely right. I think it is absolutely fair to characterize the Biden administration's February statements at this point as lies. I'm not going to do I'm not going to do public videos condemning that quite yet. But yeah, 3 months in, it's very clear that the United States is doing exactly the same kind of weasel mouth horse shit that it did during the Obama and Trump administrations. The Biden administration has gone so far as to deny that there is an embargo on Yemen. The reason that Yemenis are dying in droves of treatable diseases and actual famine, actual starvation in some cases, or just disease that becomes more of a factor because of malnutrition, is because of a horrific act of war, nightmarish, crime against humanity, blockade of the majority of Yemen's population that has been carried out by Saudi Arabia for 5 or 6 years. And the fucking Biden administration is apparently denying that that even exists, which is pretty goddamn horrifying. And maybe that was a misstatement. There's plenty of time to correct this. Maybe the Biden administration is more focused on Iran now. Yada yada yada. Okay, sure, maybe all of that may be true. Biden, the Biden administration, could very well make this seem like ill-mannered sniping, but it's time. It's time. Yemen cannot wait. Like the Houthis are winning the war, and they are encroaching upon Marib, which has a large population of refugees. But this idea that we're just going to sort of, use those folks to justify continuing the starvation of the rest of the country is amoral and inhuman. It's real grim to see the Biden administration fall into that. It's not something we should do. The embargo continues. U.S. support for Saudi offensive operations absolutely continues. The Biden administration lied to us in February of 2021. To be honest about what that was. Another sort of grimly disappointing milestone. This is fairly new. This is fairly this is an Associated Press report from April 29th. It's not conclusive, but considering how little resources there are and how little reporting we're actually getting out of Ethiopia, I think we need to talk about Ethiopian concentration camps. And I just realized we have to I have a whole bunch of comments to read before I get to Ethiopian concentration camps. But Jesus, this is pretty grim and strikingly reminiscent of the Armenian genocide, in fact. But anyway, let's, before we get to that unhappy development, let's talk about the comments here. Mert Muftiel says, yeah, that is a good point on China under-delivering there during the Trump years. It's the extraordinary missed opportunity. I call it China's biggest opportunity since Pearl Harbor, because many forget that when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and created the United States as an ally for China, or more or less created, the Chinese had been battling against the Japanese invasion since 1937. Donald Trump was the biggest opportunity for China since Pearl Harbor, and they flubbed it. Fadel says, a lot of people are unaware of the role Libya had in Africa. It was the place where a ton of seasonal workers came every year from the rest of Africa to make their livelihood. Gaddafi was very into the idea of Pan-African unity. I think there's a lot of North Africa and the Middle East that pays a lot of lip service to solidarity with Africa, but is also deeply rooted in ancient and modern sort of racist views of Africans. I will always remember being in a bar in Lebanon where this Arab kid just punched a black server because he thought it was funny. And to my eternal shame, I didn't throw that Arab kid through a wall because, one should not start fights in Lebanon with Arabs. It is a very established sort of deep sort of Arab racism towards Africans. And Gaddafi, well, I'm sure, felt a lot of that as well, seemed much more interested than other sort of anti-colonial, anti-imperialist types in forging real solidarity with Africa and Africans, sub-Saharan Africans. Black Africans, I think that's an appropriate way to say it. Of course, that was because Gaddafi was like batshit crazy and saw himself as a messiah and and whatnot. But the way that it worked practically was that Libya was a source, as Fadel points out, was a source of jobs and money and investment across the Sahel. And that is another reason why removing Gaddafi was such a goddamn disaster. Local Extreme says, just to remind everyone that China's growth is artificial. This isn't me saying it. The Chinese premier himself admitted. Yes, of course. Very true. A lot of statistics are falsified everywhere. Chinese statistics, Indian statistics have both famously been disproven, to be proven to be somewhat fantastical in recent decades. There's a whole who else was famously lying? Was there someone in Europe? I mean, obviously Greece lied about its GDP before 2009. But yeah, I mean, this is a thing that happens. There's a deep literature on sort of what is the real growth rate of China or India or Europe. It's these things are quite fraught. Important to remember that GDP is sort of a made-up number. I mean, a deeply, deeply made-up number. I too am guilty on this channel of speaking about GDP as if it's a be-all and end-all, but it's really, I mean, it is a completely made-up thing, and it's a model. And I'm not saying like models are invalid. It's just we should keep in mind that these are estimates. These are people's best estimates. I think it was famously Nigeria, like its GDP went up 33% in 1 year because it just incorporated a range of things in their GDP measurement that had not been incorporated before. But yeah, sure, like no question that it's also in the interests of countries, certainly countries that are developing, to lie about these sorts of things, and that is something that has definitely happened. Fadel says, what about Africa? They seem to have handled COVID-19 decently well. That's true, and I hope that they will continue to do so. Africa, much like Asia, Southeast Asia, or Northeast Asia, with SARS, Africa has a surprisingly robust public health infrastructure. I mean, still very poor countries, but because of AIDS, because of HIV, they've got real history with epidemics. And thus far, it seems as though that has helped them handle, and Ebola, of course, has helped them handle coronavirus better. I hope and pray that continues to be the case. But recall that 6 months ago, India was seen as a huge COVID success story as well. So I hope that African countries remain vigilant. Local Extreme says Africa actually has a good experience with diseases thanks to the experience with AIDS and malaria. But you're just way ahead of me, man. Local Extreme says the Houthis have won the war. Yeah, that's the Houthis, man. The Houthis won the war so many times. I mean, I think the most concrete moment for me where I sort of declared it over was 2019 or even back to 2018 now, when the UAE was like, okay, we're taking our ground troops out of here. We'll continue to support our guys in the South, but like, this is clearly more costly to us for PR terms than it is yielding victory. The UAE got everything they wanted, pulled out, and Saudi Arabia is just sort of like barely hanging on by its fingers and fingernails, at the cost of billions of dollars a week, I think. Salman Siddiqui said, did you catch MBS's recent interview? I did not, and I should definitely read that. I need to do more Saudi Arabia videos. I will make a note of that. Loco Extreme says, recently I've seen Trumpists gloat about Biden's refusal to end the war in Yemen. I wonder how it would be if Trump won. If Trump won, there would be no question of ending the war. The fact that Biden has lied to us. Biden is failing to end the war in Yemen, but I do have hopes that he'll get there. There would have been no hope for Yemen if Trump had been president for another 4 years. So yeah, Ethiopia. This is new. This is April 29th, so 2 days ago. The Associated Press reported that far beyond the arrests of a few Tigrayan military figures in the Ethiopian military, we've got at least 1,000, maybe many more, Tigrayans who used to have positions of power in Ethiopian society more generally. We're talking priests, we're talking doctors, have been arrested and thrown in camps together. And that's fucking horrifying. Just for review, since the U.S. election, almost exactly, in November, Ethiopia has been carrying out a war against the Tigrayan, the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, a old school guerrilla group based in the Tigray province of Ethiopia. And also, by extension, it certainly now seems, with this recent news, a war against the Tigrayan people. This is something that has been roundly condemned. I was not condemning quite so hard because I can sort of see the political calculus that Abiy Ahmed was making here. The TPLF, the Tigrayans more generally, ruled Ethiopia fairly straightforwardly. For 30 years, since the fall of the Derg in 92, I think. In 1992, so a quarter century, the TPLF was on top in Ethiopia, had obviously that gave Tigrayans access to high realms of power and good jobs and placement throughout Ethiopia. And I think that part of Abiy Ahmed is not Tigrayan, though he had to speak Tigrayan, interestingly, to make it as far up the Ethiopian political ladder as he did prior to coming to power in 2018, I think. But he is not Tigrayan, he is Oromo. And I think this war against the Tigrayans, TPLF, was, I think, an attempt to consolidate the rest of Ethiopia around him. Tigrayans, I think, only represent about 5% of the Ethiopian population. So I think it's quite natural, in fact, that Tigrayans would be losing their jobs, falling out of positions of power as this dynamic went on. There is a difference between that and these Tigrayans not just losing their jobs, but also being collected together in camps where they have lost their freedom, and there's a distinct potential that they will lose their lives. This is something we have seen before, folks. What this begins to look like to me is decapitation, which is terminology that jumps out at me from recent reading I've been doing around the Armenian genocide. Famously, before sending all those Armenian, peasants and middle-class folks out to death marches into the desert, the Ottoman hierarchy carried out a decapitation, which was the arrest and eventual mass execution of Armenian leadership folks with power in the Ottoman society. This that the Ethiopian government is doing looks a lot like decapitation to me now, and it's early. This could be misinterpreted. This could be overinterpreted. But if we're going to see something like this happening, it's something you have to call out now. And it's interesting. Maybe this is bias on my own part. It's pretty fucked up that we've known for months now that thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, of Tigrayans are losing their lives in sort of militia action and fighting in Tigray. But this just sort of broader society-wide horror of, leadership of a certain ethnicity being thrown in camps is something else, and it is something bigger. And when you put that together with these deaths and fighting in Tigray, you're looking at something that looks a lot more genocidal. So if you're wondering if I'm getting a lot less sympathetic to Abiy Ahmed than I have been thus far on this channel, the answer is yes. So yeah, this is grim. Man, this is ending up as a grimmer live chat than I had hoped. But this is the world we look at. All right, that's what I have to say about Ethiopia. See, recently Mr. Trump was quoted. Libya has announced a $50 billion rebuilding fund. I'm sorry if I got derailed. I really was gonna. The next thing on my list was really gonna be a Libya update. I need to actually, Fadel. Yeah, if you want to send me links, Fadel, through email or on Twitter or whatever. Like I've got Libya is on my. I've decided with the channel. It's like I've done all these changes. Nothing. The channel hasn't returned to growth the way that I wanted. So screw it. I'm just gonna do the hits for a month. I'm gonna do Saudi Arabia videos. I'm gonna do North Africa videos. Great. And I think Libya is going to be first. Fadel, anybody else, if you got links on stuff for Libya that you think I should read, please send them my way. And yeah, I need to read that MBS review that Salman mentioned. So yeah, let's see. If I recall, okay, Libya has announced a $50 billion rebuilding fund. That sounds great. I need to do more Libya research. Libya has announced a $50 billion rebuilding fund. That sounds great. I need to do more Libya research. If I recall, Libya has a $65 billion sovereign wealth fund. Very cool. Logo Cool Extreme says, good call on Gaddafi's part. Is that attempting to lead Africa? Fadel says, Logo Cool Extreme, Libya actually has hundreds of billions in frozen assets, but the government currently has access to roughly $80 billion. That's a fascinating aspect that I should probably look into a little bit more, the assets that are available to the Libyan government. So this is sort of like a broader theme, sort of coming along with weirdly playing into, I noticed in the past couple of days that the Biden administration has confirmed the Trump administration's recognition of Morocco's rights to the Western Sahara. This is something that horrifies a lot of folks who are into international law and the idea of self-determination. I think dramatically oversimplifying, 50 years ago, I guess at this point, 70 or 75, the Moroccan government, based on its claim that what is now Western Sahara was a part of the Moroccan Empire before the French colonization. About 50 years ago, they rolled in to Western Sahara, it was formerly Spanish Sahara, and took it over. The United Nations at the time said, this is not cool. You are not supposed to just roll into neighboring countries and take things over. That is a very valuable principle that absolutely should be preserved. It is in fucking everybody's interest that it be preserved. That's why, especially Russia's, which made their Ukraine annexation so fucking stupid in 2014, as will be revealed over the course of our lives. I'm kind of torn on this because yes, that it's a valuable principle that should have been preserved, but also Morocco has controlled this territory on a more or less solid front. I guess the front line's only been solid for 30 years now, but it's like it's sort of there, it's sort of happened. Of course, this is not good from the Palestinian perspective, because it sort of acts against that, because I think Palestinians have a bunch of UN resolutions from the 40s that they rely on, 40s and 50s that they rely on for their national struggle. But yeah, I find it real hard. I made a video on Western Sahara and the Morocco-Algeria issue, and I've often talked about how it mostly just pisses me off that it's kept Morocco and Algeria, two very large, should be wealthy, should be middle income countries, at each other's throats rather than working together to develop. So yeah, I'm not super, I totally get the principle and why it's bad that we seem to be giving up as a world on the idea of self-determination and holding people responsible for conquest and being against it. But we're now talking about something that happened 50 years ago. So I think it's at most, it's like maybe 1 million folks who are holding up the development and cooperation of 35 and 45 million people in Algeria and Morocco. So I don't know. I just don't care. Is that wrong? Anyway, but what this did put me in mind of was Ethiopia doing concentration camps, the potential of Morocco and Algeria getting into a fight over territory, the potential of Ethiopia and the potential of Ethiopia and Egypt getting into a shooting war, which I've spoken very dismissively about over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which I've been dismissive about, but could totally happen. And it's all very 19th century. It's fascinating to me the way that imperialism sort of delayed imperialist actions by these countries. You look at a lot of these places in Africa, and because they were so, I mean, they're just discovering, I mean, really only 50 years into, 50, 60, 70 years into self-determination, renewed self-determination for a lot of these countries. Of course, Ethiopia was always free, et cetera, et cetera. But it does seem interesting that a lot of countries in Africa are now exerting themselves in ways that are strikingly reminiscent of the ways that European empires sought to exert themselves in the 19th century. And on the one hand, it's good, freedom, self-determination, countries asserting their right to be powers in their own right. That is not something I can see myself opposing as someone who's all for freedom. But of course, as we all know, that British imperial system that featured folks acting out in that way and in those ways eventually ended with some pretty horrific catastrophes. So it would be nice if we could allow national self-determination and sort of individual dignity and national rights grow and become more consolidated without the associated horror and destruction. So yeah, but it's just something I've been thinking about. I don't know if that makes a ton of sense. We're closing in here. This may be doing this for under, unless you guys start asking a lot more questions. This might take less than 2 hours, which would be very uncharacteristic. Wow, I mean, are you guys still there? I haven't seen. I have no new comments. There's supposedly 6 people watching, but I have no new questions or comments from my about Ethiopia concentration camps or my delayed 20th century concept. Is anybody out there? Let's talk about Russia's Czech bombing. It's interesting how this seems to have fallen out of the headlines, which is, I think, not what the Czechs wanted, nor is it something that is good. It's fascinating how we're nominally in. Salman Siddiqui says it's also grim. Sorry, but that's got to talk about what's happening. And I think this is potentially less grim, the Russia-Czech bombing thing. So it's fascinating to me that we are in this extraordinarily anti-Russian mindset in the United States, where everybody's being insufficiently positive and pleasant about the prospect of World War III with Russia, or sort of Washington D.C. is like, why aren't people more aggressive? Or I don't know. Like, it's just being aggressive towards Russia is political correctness right now. That's what is supposed to be. We're supposed to talk about in U.S. media. It's what we're supposed to talk about in Washington D.C. Yet it seems like only certain kinds of aggression of work against Russia is stuff that we want to talk about. We only want to talk about violence led responses to Russia. We want to talk about arming Ukraine. We want to talk about how Ukraine's gonna fight back against Russia. We want to talk about how the United States is going to use its power to keep Russian gas from going into Germany. It's all about how the United States is going to do this. United States is going to do that. United States is going to do that. And there's almost no. Striking to me that 2 weeks ago, which was reported on. The Czech Republic, which had some elements, sorry, I think it's Czechia now. I don't think we call it the Czech Republic anymore. Czechia, which had elements within its government that were sympathetic towards Russia, broke diplomatic relations with Russia in a very loud and public way as a response to their intelligence assessment that Russia had Russian secrets, I don't know, Russian intelligence assets had, perhaps unintentionally, blown up a weapons depot in Czechia because those arms were supposed to go to the Ukrainians. It's a tremendous escalation for Russia to take action against a EU and I believe NATO country. It's a really big deal that this is, and it's not just the United States saying this. The Czech intelligence authorities, seem to believe this happened. This happened 2 weeks ago. Czechia's response was to throw out a large number of Russian diplomats. So not breaking off negotiations, relations entirely, but clearing out a lot of Russian diplomatic staff. This is both has a political, traditionally has a political value. This signals extreme displeasure to take an action like this. And it also, I think it's well acknowledged that the diplomatic staff in most countries often has an intelligence gathering role. There are absolutely in every embassy and consulate, there are plenty of diplomats from every country who are, do boring cultural stuff and try to drum up business for their country. That's what they do. But also, to the extent that there are intelligence actors in a country, they are likely to be within those diplomatic staffs. So what the Czechs did is they threw out a lot of that diplomatic staff. And the Russians retaliated. And it's fascinating, sort of that, what I don't think anybody has connected, and I think might actually be kind of key, is like, what role did this have with, in connection with how quickly Russia's military maneuvers on the Ukrainian border went away? I've talked about how those maneuvers were unlikely to be a preface to a real invasion of Ukraine. It was sort of a North Korea style dick waving to remind the Biden administration they were there and they had to be reckoned with. But this action by the Czech Republic, throwing out all these diplomats, very quickly made it pretty clear that Russia, who thought it had improving relations with Europe, that those relations were not improving as much as they'd hoped. As with China, Donald Trump provided an amazing opportunity to Russia. Certainly was bad for Russian relations with the United States, but was pretty good for Russian relationship with the EU because Trump is an asshole and was a very unattractive person, and it made Europe more interested in finally squashing the unpleasantness since 2014. And this, unpleasantness from 2014 cropping up and burning Russia this way, I think probably had a very important effect. This is diplomacy working. Not something that's being mentioned in the New York Times, but by Googling it, I saw that this is having a ramifying effect across Eastern Europe. A lot of countries that Russia wants to cozy up to are throwing out Russian diplomatic folks as well. And of course, Russia is retaliating by throwing out, the diplomatic folks for those countries. But it is screwing up a great Russian opportunity in Europe. And I think it's pretty great to see that consequences for bad actions by a great power on behalf of countries that are quite weak in comparison, quite possibly having real effects on Russian policy. Of course, we don't want to hear that. We don't want to hear about how, in the United States, we don't want to hear how these diplomatic efforts by small countries might actually be bearing fruit. So in none of the articles mentioning that the end of, and scheduled end most probably, but who knows what that actually means. The end of Russian maneuvers and how those maneuvers had created tensions. I'd say probably none of them mentioned that, oh, yeah, by the way, the Czech Republic threw out all these Russian diplomats. And that was absolutely part of the sort of calculations that the Russian state was making. So anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting. All right. Salman Siddiqui says, it's all so grim. Martin Muftil says, still here. Logan Groom says, sorry, I went to grab a mango to snack on. Did I miss anything after Fadel's comment? Well, yes, man. I've been talking for a while. Anyway, Fadel, with the increase in Western European anti-immigration nationalists, how will this affect the Biden administration's relationship with Europe? I don't think. It depends on how that anti-immigrant nationalism is expressed. I think that the U.S. government, as it is acting itself, has accommodated itself to European countries taking actions to close down what is, under international law, its obligations to take in refugees and immigrants. And I don't think Biden is as eager to restart the U.S. immigration machine as some of us, including myself, had hoped. So it's one thing if they start electing vicious vocal racists, but that's not. I don't think that's the state of Western or even Eastern European nationalist anti-immigrant politics anymore. It's all about, oh, well, we want to prevent brain drain from these places, and there's only so many we can take in. And I think it's more polite and palatable, and I think that to the extent that it's polite and as long as anti-immigration politicking in Europe stays on the polite and palatable wolf in sheep's clothing level, I don't see how anyone in the Biden administration would object to it, because unfortunately we seem to be doing aspects of the same thing here in the United States. I am more confident that immigration will continue and certainly not get back to the levels of the past decade or decades prior in the United States, but will recover. It is just too much in the way that the United States works that is geared towards that. It is our natural state. I do wonder if Europe, I think at least for the next couple decades, I think Europe is probably going to sit out or stop as much migration as it can. However, then of course, Germany won't, because they quite wisely, threw in 1 million people before the backlash started. But I think a lot of European countries are going to start running into serious demographic decline. And then we'll eventually have to restart migration to some extent. Yeah, I don't think, I think that, I think Obama was willing to back up Merkel in, her insistence that European countries, be more friendly towards migrants. But I think that's probably over, which ain't great. But yeah, wow, it's a depressing patrons only live chat this week. Sorry, folks. This month. Sorry, folks. Okay, so we've got Mert Mufti says there's got to be some other reason for sudden and massive Russian withdrawal. I think it was scheduled. Really, I don't think it's that surprising. So there was a buildup of Russian troops around the Ukrainian border, forever claimed by the Russian government to be a exercise that was going, and the exercise ended. I don't think it was a precipitous withdrawal of Russian troops. I think that if, with all those troops there, Putin had made the calculus that, well, this seems to be working out better than I thought. Nobody's really complaining too much, or actually it's creating more dissension between the U.S. and Europe then I thought this is working out great. Then yeah, sure, the troops would have been extended, but I think Putin saw that, well, okay, Merkel's pretty pissed off about this. The goal of Russian policy is to drive Biden and Merkel away from each other, not closer together. So it's like, well, shit, this probably isn't working out. Guess we better just end the exercise as planned. So yeah, I think there was a lot of dishonest coverage in the West that was like, oh, what is this like? Incredible buildup, as almost all Western journalism is oriented towards World War III is coming tomorrow. When it was a military exercise. And if that military exercise had created dissension between the United States and Europe, yeah, sure, I'm sure those troops could have hung out there for months or permanently or whatnot. But that was not the effect that was happening. I think quite possibly the Czech action was one of the things they considered when they're like, well, this is going fucking terribly. Like now they're throwing stuff from 2014 at us. Yeah, definitely end it the way we were supposed to end it initially. And they ended it. They didn't end it like, so yeah. I think, does that make sense, Mark? Local Shum says, does the Czech bombing count as an act of war? I feel Russia did that in American soil. We'd see foreign troops in St. Petersburg. Well, we would not see foreign troops in St. Petersburg, Loga, because Russia has nuclear weapons. What we would see would be probably a U.S. enforced oil and gas embargo on Russia, which, is pretty much an act of war as well. But yeah, 100%. Yeah, if you could find conclusive evidence that Russian agents blew up a power plant in the United States, yeah, of course that's an act of war. It's the sort of thing that Israel can do all the fucking time. But it's a very big deal, and Czechia's response is really all it can do. But I think it is, making an impression, at least with other European countries, and helping to build European solidarity against Russia, which is exactly what Russia most doesn't want to happen. But yeah, no, I don't. A U.S. invasion of Russia is something that we will never see. I think also that's, thank God. And I think that's also the reason why Ukraine and Georgia are not in NATO and hopefully never will be, is because the real prospect of conflict between U.S. and Russian troops is something that all human beings want to avoid at all costs. Because if a U.S. and a Russian soldier are fighting, there will be some asshole in the U.S. or Russian, Joint Chiefs of Staff office going, well, we're just going to have to nuke somebody, if things don't go well for anybody. And yeah, it'd be guaranteed pretty much to go poorly for people. So yeah, that'd be bad news. So yeah, I think that would be why the Russians would never be stupid enough to carry out a physical attack on U.S. soil. And one would fucking hope the U.S. intelligence agencies wouldn't be stupid enough to carry out a physical attack on Russian soil either. Local Stream says, not restarting your immigration engine is idiotic. It's talking to the United States, I presume. You're literally throwing away money people are giving you because brown people talk weird. Yep. Yeah. Nope. Yeah, you're 100% right on that one, Loga. I got nothing to say to that in response to that. The immigration engine is what has made the United States the United States. If it is preserved, there will never be, that's a little overtly, no, it's jingoistic patriotic, but yeah, if we continued accepting people at the rate that we were accepting people in the 90s or the 2000s, the date of the end of U.S. hegemony would recede on forever into the future. It would, what would defeat U.S. hegemony would be like a different brand of human being, because it would be that far into the future. Like, yeah, maybe like the Martians would unseat. The Martian humans would unseat the U.S. humans as the leading factor in Earth politics at some point in the 2400s or something, if the U.S. kept its immigration engine going. But we've opted not to do that, which is fucking stupid. But who knows? Maybe like the world wars, or maybe that's better for human freedom and flourishing. It makes me sad though, but I'm biased. You know, I'm a patriotic American. On the topic of immigration, Tucker Carlson said in a video that the biggest attack on American democracy was the Immigration Act of 1965. You know, the law that, did he really fucking say that? Just a racist piece of shit. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have much to say to that. Wow. Amazing. I mean, part of this is there's backlash. There were the biggest U.S. wave of immigration was in, you know, relative to the size of the U.S. population at the time, was in like the 1840s, actually, because in the 1840s was a time of tremendous actual starvation and tumult in Europe. So you famously had an extraordinary influx of Irish and Germans. Those were the biggest populations, but also a wide range of Europeans. And there was a backlash to that. There was the Know Nothing Party or what have you. That backlash didn't get large enough to have a serious legislative component and response, because it was just in the 1840s and 1850s, it was just so eye-bleedingly obvious that like it was in the interests of the United States, well, you know, our racist project of peopling the continent, and, you know, dispossessing the Native Americans was still an open question at that point. So like in the 1840s, there was a big backlash against that incredibly transformative wash of Catholic Europeans into the United States in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. But there was no legislative response to it because we still just wanted to, you know, the Catholics were better than Native Americans in our minds at that point, and that was still an open question. In the 1890s, I think in the 1880s, 1890s, and 1910s, we had the second biggest wave of immigration to the United States in terms of relative population things. That was absolutely transformative. I mean, the extent to which the New York City of today, which I am looking at now, which I live in today, is still marked by that influx of Italian, Slavic, and I mean, I guess identified primarily as some identified primarily as Jewish, as a separate, even though they're all Slavic as well, but like are broken out for a variety of reasons, a different population. You know, the influx in the 1880s, 90s, and 10s that like tremendously transformative. And with that one, the frontier was closed. There was, you know, the Native Americans had been beaten. And by the 1920s, there was the backlash against that extraordinary migration of new groups, Southern Europeans, much more heavily Catholic than even the Irish and the Germans were, and Jewish as well. Like the reaction against that was so strong that in the 1920s, we got serious legislation against migration that was overturned eventually in 1965. So as much as it pains me, I think even though, and it's interesting about each of these waves of migration are considerably smaller in proportional terms. If you compare, I mean, in numerical terms, of course, they're much larger. But if you compare the number of people who came in the wave in the 70s, 80s, 90s wave compared to, it's bigger in numbers than the 1880s, 90s, 1910s wave. But proportional to the amount of people that are in the United States, it's tiny. Like it's tiny compared to those bigger waves. And as much as I dislike it, it appears that that cycle may be continuing, and we may be getting to a point now where we're just so chicken shit that even this tiny addition to our population, we're too weak to absorb it culturally and politically. And the fact that Tucker Carlson can say shit like that and still have a TV show leads me to believe that there's there's a real sort of deep-seated backlash, which makes me tremendously sad. But also, what's important to remember is that Tucker Carlson has lost. We were before the 1880s wave. We were still a Protestant country. That was something we really cared about. In fact, that was it's something that used to be tremendously important, even into the youths of my parents' generation. It was, you're not going to marry a Catholic, are you? Would you let your daughter marry a Mormon? The religious prejudices of the United States were important for long after they became an impossibility with the 1880s, 1890s, 1910s wave, and the race prejudice of would you let your daughter marry a Indian American or something like that? Of course, nobody would express that, but that sort of conscious racism, unconscious racism, will persist for decades beyond this. But the country has already been irrevocably changed, just as the country was irrevocably changed by the immigration wave in the 1840s, the immigration wave in the 80s, 90s, 10s. And the immigration wave of the 70s, 80s, 90s has irrevocably changed the country as well. And it will be very sad to me if it's another 40 years. Start the clock from Trump and his breaking of the immigration engine. So like maybe we don't get the next return of an immigration wave to the United States until I'm very old in the 2050s, or dead. Actually, I think judging by this gut, I'll be dead in the 2050s. And I think that'd be sad. That'd be a great tragedy, but it also wouldn't be out of character with the large arc. And yeah, Tucker Carlson has lost the idea that folks with the indigenous heritage of Latin America or from Africa or India or China are not American in some way is an idea that is swiftly still held in way too many places like Tucker Carlson and Fox News, but is an idea that is swiftly dissipating and is an idea that is if not dead, is dying. So yeah, Tucker Carlson has lost in the long term, but unfortunately in the short term, he appears to have won, just as the anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish bigots of the 1920s won in the short term. They've lost so comprehensively that you can actually have a lot of Catholic and Jewish bigots supporting this wave of immigration restriction, which is sad, but in and of itself is a measure of the success of the American idea. So that's what I have to say about that. Sorry if there was a lot of that, but yeah, I clearly have emotions to express on the immigration front. Okay, local stream and Asian immigrant only in the United States, while the U.S. system. Oh, okay, you discriminate for Europe and Asian immigration only in the United States. Well, the U.S. system is still heavily biased against foreign people of color, even high-skilled ones. No offense no, I mean, of course, we're biased immigration systems. Immigration systems are racist by their nature. At what point does it stop being a dog whistle and start becoming a goddamn foghorn? Yeah, I think referring to Tucker Carlson. Yeah, I mean that Tucker Carlson is the white power hour, is how it's characterized, and I think it's quite accurate. And he's got a lot of fans, and continues to be a thing. Salman Siddiqui says, on a side note, whatever happened to the German Americans? You never hear that term like you do with Italian or Irish Americans. To some extent, I'm a German American. More than I'd thought, actually. I had sort of always said, well, dad's side is the folks who came over in the 1870s who were German. But actually, I didn't realize that on my mom's side as well, I've got German great-grandparents. So I do have, which is, I guess it's probably bad that I consider this a point of pride, but I do. But I do have some ancestors on my mother's side who go back to 1640. But I'm probably, God, I guess I'm probably, 30 or 40% German immigrant. from different strands in my family, in my heritage. German American immigrant, and yeah, it just sort of. I think they if you look at it, I think that number one unified, which is fucked up actually, because you should probably break it out according to African countries, right? But I think that the African, if you consider the entire continent of Africa as one country, which is deeply fucked up, but actually for these purposes better, the largest unified descent of Americans is ancestry of Americans is African, and then the second is German. Or actually, German might be first, and African might be second. So yeah. Anyway, which is an interesting thing, and yeah, as pointed out, is German American identity is not a thing, and for that, you have to thank not just Hitler but also the Kaiser. World War I and World War II were tremendously influential events in American culture. And despite the fact that the leader of the U.S. War in World War II in World War II in Europe was Eisenhower, General Eisenhower. He was, obviously of German descent. I think of far distant German descent. He might have actually been a, sort of 1700s German descent, but still, Eisenhower was the leader of the American forces in Europe in World War II. But a distinct German American culture was consciously crushed during World War I. It's quite authoritarian. Like, the more you read about Woodrow Wilson, the more you're like, holy fuck. Because before everyone knew what Hitler and Stalin and the kinds of things that Hitler and Stalin did were, U.S. presidents had more leeway to be scary authoritarian fucks. And Woodrow Wilson was a scary authoritarian fuck. And German Americans who lived in the United States around the time of World War I very quickly distanced themselves. And they didn't have they had a luxury that Japanese Americans did not have during World War II, which is that they could change their names. They could stop speaking German, and they were Americans. And that had a tremendous effect on German American identity in the United States. There are other aspects when you're absorbing into a sort of Protestant milieu, as the Germans were. A lot of those Germans were Protestant, and it became easier for them to pass into the mainstream of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture much more easily. I've also got technically some Irish descent, but it wasn't Catholic Irish descent. It was Protestant Irish descent. So that's another aspect of German, sort of the disappearance of German Americans. One of the sadder stories is, I think, through a lot of, I think it's Minnesota. Is it Minnesota famously? But there's a lot of areas in the Midwestern United States where the churches were conducted services in German until 1914, or until 1917, probably. So yeah, German American culture was very consciously crushed by German Americans. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. I wonder if bringing in immigrants in large numbers again would end the venture capital glut in the U.S. stock market. I mean, I think what there's probably a chance of doing, and is absolutely something I would fight for, is doing what Canada does, which is open up the high-skilled immigration. So continue the brain drain aspects and stop taking the poor huddled masses. I think that's something that could happen. And I think is probably a priority for the Biden administration, to the extent it has immigration priorities, is dramatically jacking up the amount of high-skilled immigration that the United States takes, while doing nothing more about the huddled masses. I think ideally what I would like to see is complete opening up of high-skilled immigration, which is really, I mean, that's still only like what, a couple 100,000. Just adding like, a couple 100,000 a year of that would probably screw Canada entirely and take the majority of high skilled folks who are on offer in a given year. And then dramatically stepping up our refugee admissions. So actual people who are fleeing conflicts that the United States created, like dramatically stepping up the amount of Syrians, Yemenis, Afghans, Iraqis we take. And actually probably Central Americans as well, because why the hell not? And then I would be okay actually with taking some time off the economic refugee thing, because clearly judging again by the fact that Tucker Carlson is allowed to remain on network television, clearly our society is not handling not handling immigration as well as it used to. Let's see. I wonder if immigrants in large numbers again would. Okay. Salman Siddiqui says World War I happened and the U.S. government decided to crush the second most talked language in the United States. That is something that happened. Yeah, that is something that happened. It's a weird country. I love it. It's a weird country. Fadel says the Great Replacement conspiracy theory is becoming quite popular among the Danish right-wing youth. Yeah, I mean, if the U.S. is reaching a point of immigration saturation to the point where it's beginning to look racist and fucked up, and well, when it comes to immigration, European countries are so much weaker than the United States. It's not in the, it's not, at least in the popular imagination of the history and culture of those countries, to be as welcoming for migrants. And yeah, it seems like that's breaking down even further in Europe, which is also profoundly sad. I am, but I've said, I mean, Denmark is sort of on the line there, but if France or Germany or the United Kingdom or Spain wants to bitch about, or Italy wants to bitch about the number of migrants they're taking, fuck them, like, hey man, it's an imperial world that you built and you benefited from, and you should honor your internationally committed obligations as far as migration. But when it comes to Eastern Europe, and honestly, when it comes to Scandinavia as well, I'm a little less angry about Scandinavia and Eastern Europe's ability to, make decisions to control the composition of their population. I might find them distasteful and find them racist. I might think they're stupid, considering the demographic challenges of a lot of these countries. But I do think that they have the right to make those choices. It's the More Freedom Foundation. I do believe in national self-determination, and if the Poles and the Hungarians have decided to cut off a lot of access to talent and young people that could keep their economies going, well, I think that's their choice to make for European countries that lack an imperial history. I'm more sympathetic to. Because, I mean, let's keep in mind that like Poland and Hungary and most of Eastern Europe, these are victims of imperialism, and sort of saying to them, well, you couldn't make any choices about the way you lived your life at all up until the 1990s. And now here's a whole bunch of, and you haven't yet reached wealth. So here's a whole bunch of other folks that whose countries we destroyed that you're responsible for looking after. So I am more sympathetic to Scandinavian and Eastern European countries that are just like, we can't, we've done as much as we can, and we don't want to do anymore because we feel that, whatever our national self-conception, we're too weak to handle these flows of migration. And I'm inclined to allow Eastern European and Scandinavian countries to make those choices, where I am not for the French or the British or the Germans, or the Spanish, wealthy countries who profited from the destruction of colonialism. So anyway, I don't know if that makes sense. Fadel, tell them to talk to girls and get laid for fuck's sake. Yes, I think the appropriate response for white people from the who are worried about great replacement is stop playing all those fucking video games and do a little dating and knock somebody up. Losers. Anyway, they'd probably call the women degenerate for that. Well, it's unfortunate. They still want women to be promiscuous. They just want them to be promiscuous to them. Actually, you'd be surprised. I generally think you could get up to a few million high-skilled a year. I'd be down to take in a few million high-skilled migrants a year. That sounds pretty fucking great. Fadel says, local extreme, their whole ideology is a contradiction. Yes, racists are stupid. Denmark certainly was imperial. It had colonies in Ghana. What? I had no idea. Well, that's embarrassing. That's something. I really hate it when there's things I don't know, Fadel. Denmark colonies. Denmark colonies. Ghana. All right. Well, learn something new every day. Thank you, Fadel. Wow. I did not know that. Jesus. All right. I mean, was it like they had colonies in the 20, in like the 1600s before the British took it from them? Like that's sort of, I don't know, it seems sort of like before time to me. But anyway, that's something I'll have to research. Wow. Okay, so we have Saudi peace with Iran. That's a thing that's not happening. But what's interesting, and maybe this gets back to that interview with MBS I have not read, is that there's a very real opening between Saudi Arabia and Iran. They're saying nice things about each other, or at least saying nice things about the idea of saying nice things about each other. And for me, that's just an indication of like how artificial this rivalry between Iran and everybody else is. I mean, it's something that the U.S. and Israel have largely cooked up to justify their arms expenditure. And it's interesting to see Saudi Arabia, like the second it seems like Iran and the U.S. might finally be, getting a little more on the same page, Saudi Arabia's like, oh, I am definitely eager to get back on the same page too, which I think is smart on Saudi Arabia's part, because I think there's probably been, especially after the bombing of the Abqaiq refinery a couple of years back, a realization that Saudi Arabia is kind of being used as a pawn by the United States and Israel. If actual conflict breaks out between Israel and Iran and the United States, Saudi Arabia is going to get brutalized, get like absolutely the floor wiped with it. The fucked up thing is that even in the context of Iran and the United States being in a shooting war, Iran is going to be very aware that their main goal is to get the U.S. public to be sick of the war in Iran, like with the Middle East. And even in that context, Iran's probably not going to want to bomb Israeli civilians. But Iran's going to absolutely want to, because if they bomb Israeli civilians, they're going to make the U.S. public more angry at Iran and more likely to continue fighting Iran and more likely to bomb the shit out of Tehran. So what's going to happen in a fight, I've made a video about this before, between Iran and the United States and Israel, is Saudi Arabia's oil refineries will get wiped off the face of the planet. And maybe, as another step in escalation, serious civil bombing of Riyadh. So I think it's very smart of Saudi Arabia to, as the second an opening has appeared, to start making friends with Iran, because it ain't the Israeli public or the U.S. public that is going to suffer in the context of the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran. It's the Saudis. But yeah, it's also just like this idea that Saudi Arabia and Iran, they can't, thousands of years of hatred, they can't possibly ever work together. Actually, no, it's the U.S. and Israel keeping the hostility going. And the second it looks like the U.S. is backing down a little bit, Saudi Arabia is like, hey, me too, let's do peace. So yeah. Armenian genocide recognition. Very interesting. I think I make pretty clear, and I've said in public videos, the Armenian genocide is something that happened. It's something that's horrible, and it's something that nobody should dispute or question. I have also, I think, been pretty clear in saying that the Turks have a bit of a point when people seem to pretend that the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust, are the same thing and seem to be the only bad things that happened in Europe in the 20th century or the 19th century. I think the main thing that has kept the Armenian genocide such a live issue in world politics is Turkish idiocy around it. It is Turkish making it an issue, preserving it as an issue. I think this is because of Turkish misunderstanding that is shared by some folks in the Armenian diaspora that, oh gosh, genocide gets acknowledged and all of a sudden Armenians are going to be able to sue Turks left and right for some kind of reparations or privileges or getting their properties back. And it's just not true. That ain't going to work a century later. And I think there's an article that I've linked that makes that pretty clear as well. So actually, this recognition of the Armenian genocide by the United States, by the world's most powerful actor, I think has the potential to kind of diffuse the issue in ways that might redound to the benefit of the Turks and Turkey, and might be actually quite disappointing for certain activists in the Armenian diaspora. It's like, yep, they've gotten what they've always wanted, and the next step is we build a monument and move on. Which apparently, as I hadn't realized in that Carnegie Foundation document below, is actually a lot of Eastern European, a lot of Eastern Turkish towns have already actually built monuments to the Armenian populations that had been thrown out. I remember there was an Armenian church in downtown Diyarbakir that was carefully, lovingly restored, and it was bombed in fighting between, I think, utterly destroyed in fighting between Turkey and the PKK, the Kurdish group affiliated with Syrian Kurds in 2015 or 2016. So yeah. Anyway, okay, so that is everything I have planned for the program. We are at 2 hours and 15 minutes. I will read these comments, and then I think okay. I mean, I'm learning more and more about Danish colonialism. This is really embarrassing that I have to be learning these things. But like, wasn't it mostly swept up by the 19th century, which is sort of make me feel like I'm not a fucking idiot. I'm sure, I'm aware that it seems like every Western European country had an island or two in the Caribbean. Poland didn't. Standing by that. Denmark had slave plantations in the Caribbean. I was aware of that. They had 2 Indian colonies that they held on to for 225 years. What? That I was not aware of. The Virgin, we didn't commit these genocides, and it was both sides. Turkey versus the Chad, we conducted untold atrocities on Native Americans and numerous minority groups, and we should learn from it. U.S. Yes, I think that's flippant, logo, but that's true. The Virgin Chad meme, the big loser meme versus the folks who understand how power works. The Virgin, we didn't commit these genocides, and it was both sides. Turkey versus the Chad. We conducted untold atrocities on Native Americans and numerous minority groups, and we should learn from it. United States. I think that's. The Danish Indian possessions were sold to the British East India Company in 1845. That's fascinating. Learn more about Denmark. More about Denmark. Okay, so I think we're mostly there. Martin Mufti says, I grew up in Turkey. They do not teach this to the kids as genocide. Only very recently I learned about the execution of Armenian leaders and intellectuals, for example. My mistake for not studying. Good on you for studying it. Everyone should study more history. Okay. It's been 2 hours and 15 minutes. I'm very grateful to you all. I now have a Instagram account. I was at a party. How's that for post-COVID? I was at a party on Thursday night, and this gal who does marketing was laughing at me for not having more unified branding. So I have an Instagram account for More Freedom Foundation now. There's one post. I hope to do more in the coming week. But if y'all are on Instagram, you should follow me at More Freedom Foundation. That's a thing. There is a More Freedom Foundation, not Mo, but More Freedom Foundation Instagram account, which y'all should follow. That's new. I also, there's the TikTok, which is, I think, some variety of More Freedom Foundation or Mo Freedom or something, that I also intend to start populating. Want this thing to get bigger, y'all. I mean, actually, financially, I'm okay. I mean, I'm not great, but like it's like vaguely sustainable because, like my housing costs are almost covered by Patreon now, and then and then there's like a little bit of YouTube advertising money left over for food and stuff. I'm still working down savings, but thanks to Tesla stock, there's a lot more savings. So it's not the money thing. It's just I would like more people to see this content. I think that this content that you all support and have helped me develop, this way of looking at the world is worthwhile and can, I don't know, keep the world from, keep the U.S. from pushing the world in some really bad directions in the coming decades. Like I really do. It's a little arrogant, but I really do think that like what we do here is useful and vital and potentially very helpful, can impact things. If you guys have any suggestions as to how I could greater improve the reach of this project we have, I'd be grateful. Let's see. I grew up in Turkey. Danish colonialism kind of died when the Brits firebombed Copenhagen. Is that firebombing of Copenhagen? That was during the Napoleonic Wars, right? Right? It was Nelson firebombed Copenhagen. Is that right? Tell me I got something right today. But so tell me as I know something about Denmark. So have you watched Invincible? The final season had the fight between Mark and his dad, and it's much more brutal than in the comic. Well, I guess if you did a live action thing. Invincible is a fun comic book by Robert Kirkman, one of the last comic books that I regularly bought or at least in its editions, combined editions, trade paperbacks, until it finished a year or two ago. And it is now a television show that I do need to get around to watching. Unfortunately, I watch so much less TV now than I did when I was in corporate law and I had fewer free hours. Like I like reading books. I apologize. I just don't watch as much TV as I should, I suppose. And that's like, just don't have as much time or really just get as much satisfaction out of running away from, reality with TV shows anymore. Because I guess my reality is better, than it was when I was a corporate law drone. Thanks to all of you. Yeah, 1805. Yep. So that's that would definitely. I think that's definitely not. Oh no, Nelson was probably dead by then, but it was Napoleonic Wars, and it has something. It's very similar in year to Trafalgar. Fado says, "Have you watched A History of Violence? Is that the Viggo Mortensen movie? The not Cronenberg, Starship Troopers guy. I think I saw that, but it's been a very long time, and I couldn't point to anything about that. 1805 was the year. All right, folks, follow the More Freedom Foundation Instagram account. I think there's 4 people following it now. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for being patrons. Like, I don't need to do the other spiel for you guys. You are the reason this thing exists. Thanks so much, and have an awesome weekend. I'm excited to sit down or lie down. Anyway, thank you so much.